David and Rachel are a couple who seem like a dream romance. They first met when they were still in high school. A simple encounter in the school library, when Rachel was looking for a textbook and accidentally dropped it, led David to help her with a warm smile. Since then they have been inseparable. Their teenage years were filled with sweet promises, late-night conversations, and dreams about the future. After graduating from college, they truly realized those dreams. They got married, built a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, and started a seemingly flawless life together. Soon after, they were blessed with 3 children: Ethan, the intelligent eldest, Lily, who was full of curiosity, and Noah, who always brought joy to the house. From the outside, David and Rachel's family looked perfect. Their neighbors often looked at them with admiration. David worked in management, while Rachel pursued a career in corporate development. They had enough time to go on vacations, attend their children's school events, and organize their lives neatly. The family photos lining the living room wall were proof of how harmonious their life was. However, behind the smiles displayed in each portrait, something was slowly fading. Their days were filled with a busy routine. David left early in the morning and came home late at night with a tired face. Rachel, despite successfully balancing work and family, often feels exhausted. Their conversations, which used to be full of jokes and intimacy, now more often than not are only about monthly shopping, work meetings, or the children's schedules. There are nights when David sits in his home office, staring at his computer screen while listening to the sound of the television from the living room. Rachel sits on the sofa, busy staring at her cell phone. They are in the same room, but they feel far apart. The warmth that once united them is slowly being replaced by an unspoken silence. Even so, David remains convinced that his family is fine. For him, busyness and exhaustion are part of married life. He believed that as long as they stayed together, everything would be fine. Rachel also tried to convince herself that this was just a phase. They had been through so much since their teenage years, surely they could get through this unexpected boredom. What they didn't realize was that behind the seemingly solid walls of their house, small cracks were beginning to appear. These cracks were invisible, but they would slowly grow and change everything. That day, the office where David and Rachel worked was filled with a slight commotion. There was an important announcement from the company's leadership. They had a new employee, Andrew Miller, the son of the company owner who had just completed his studies at a prestigious university. The young man with a confident face attracted the attention of many people from the moment he stepped into the office hallway. Rachel was assigned to be Andrew's mentor. Her superiors believed that Rachel's extensive experience would help Andrew adapt more quickly. At first, Rachel accepted the task without much enthusiasm. However, as they began to interact, she found that Andrew had a different spirit. His ideas were fresh, he spoke with confidence, and he seemed enthusiastic to hear Rachel's opinions. There was something about Andrew that made Rachel feel valued again, something she hadn't felt in a long time. As the days passed, their meetings became more intense. They discussed new projects, devised strategies, and often worked past hours just to refine their ideas. Rachel came home later, claiming she had a lot of work to do. David welcomed her home without suspicion, even though he began to feel that something had changed. Andrew's name was heard more and more often at the dinner table. Rachel talked about his brilliant ideas, about how easy it was for Andrew to get along with everyone. David just smiled, trying to listen, even though a strange feeling was slowly growing in his chest. On the other hand, Rachel began to feel something she couldn't control. Every time Andrew smiled at her, there was a small vibration that reminded her of her youth with David. The passion that had once faded was rekindled, but not because of her husband. These feelings confused and frightened Rachel, but she chose to let them flow as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, at home, David increasingly felt alone. The evenings that were supposed to be spent together became silent. The children fell asleep early, leaving David sitting in the living room with the television on, paying no attention to it. Rachel arrived late at night, exhausted but with a different look on her face. There was a new light in her, a light that David no longer recognized. David didn't know what was really going on, but he could feel the distance growing. He didn't know that Andrew's arrival would be the beginning of a huge storm that was about to shake his whole life. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Rachel became more apparent. She often came home late, claiming to be working overtime with Andrew. Her phone rang more frequently, and every time the screen lit up, Rachel hurriedly turned it off. David noticed all of this, but he chose to remain silent. He didn't want to cause a scene just because of his suspicions. One night, David was putting Noah to bed when he heard laughter coming from the living room. He walked slowly and saw Rachel sitting on the sofa, cell phone in hand, with an unusual smile. It was an enthusiastic smile. different from the tired expression she usually brought home. David stood frozen, trying to calm his thoughts, then returned to the room without saying anything. However, his heart was filled with questions. At the dinner table, the once warm conversation had turned bland. Ethan and Lily were still chattering about school, but Rachel seemed half-hearted in listening. Every now and then she would look down, hiding her phone screen from David's view. The family moments that had once been the center of happiness slowly shifted, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. David tried to talk to Rachel. One night, after the children had gone to bed, he said softly, "I feel like we rarely have time alone together. Maybe we can go out for dinner this weekend?" Rachel was silent for a moment, then smiled faintly. "We'll see, I still have a lot of work to do," she replied briefly. Those words made David feel as if he was no longer a priority. Rachel, on the other hand, tried to convince herself that everything was fine. However, every time she was with Andrew, she felt alive again. Andrew always looked at her attentively, listening to her every word as if it were important. She felt appreciated, a passion she no longer found at home. The more she got involved, the harder it was for her to pull away. David didn't know the details, but his heart was sensitive enough. He began to realize that the cracks that were once small were now becoming more apparent. His nights were filled with anxiety. He often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long he would have to hold back these suspicious feelings. One thing was certain. Something was growing behind Rachel's silence. Something that would soon destroy the foundation of the household he had been protecting. One night, heavy rain drenched the city streets. David came home earlier than usual because a meeting had been cancelled. He hoped to enjoy a simple dinner with Rachel and the children. However, when he opened the door to his house, he found the living room empty. The television was not on, and there was no smell of cooking. The children had gone to bed early while Rachel was not home yet. David sat in his office chair, trying to calm himself by reading his work reports. Time passed until late at night. Just as he was about to turn off the lights, he heard hurried footsteps and whispers from the porch. David held his breath and approached the door. From behind the almost closed crack, he heard Rachel's voice. Her tone was soft, full of intimacy that he had never heard directed at him before. Then he heard Andrew's voice, low but clear. "I don't know how long we can keep this up," said Andrew. Rachel replied softly, "As long as we're careful, no one will know." David felt his body freeze. Those words hit him harder than the storm outside. His heart was pounding, but he didn't open the door. He chose to stand still, letting every sentence pierce his ears. "Rachel," Andrew's voice sounded again, "you make me feel alive. I don't care about any risks." There was a moment of silence before Rachel whispered, "Me too." David closed his eyes, holding back his turbulent emotions. That night, he heard firsthand the betrayal he had only suspected. Anger, disappointment, and heartache mixed together. However, instead of rushing to confront Rachel, a plan slowly formed in his mind. He knew that a simple argument wouldn't be enough. The wound was too deep to be healed by anger alone. If Rachel had secretly destroyed their family, then he would expose everything in front of the people who meant the most to them. Calmly, David decided to wait for the right moment. And that moment would come sooner than Rachel or Andrew thought. A few days after that secretive night, David went about his routine calmly. He didn't show any change in attitude toward Rachel. In fact, his calmness made Rachel feel safe, as if no one suspected anything. However, behind David's seemingly normal gaze lay a grand plan. One afternoon, David contacted Andrew with the excuse of wanting to strengthen their relationship outside of work. He invited Andrew and his wife Olivia to have dinner with his family. Andrew was surprised but couldn't refuse. Rachel, who heard the invitation, immediately felt nervous. However, David just smiled slightly, assuring her that it was just a simple family dinner. The appointed day arrived. The dining table was neatly decorated. Small candles were lit, and the aroma of cooking filled the house. Ethan, Lily, and Noah seemed enthusiastic about welcoming the guests. Olivia arrived in a simple dress, her face full of sincere smiles, while Andrew looked a little awkward. Rachel was busy pacing back and forth preparing the dishes, trying to hide her anxiety. The evening began warmly. Glasses clinked, children laughed, and light conversation flowed. Olivia talked about her daily activities, while Andrew added brief comments, occasionally glancing nervously at Rachel. David listened quietly, his voice remaining friendly. No one suspected that a big storm was waiting to explode. When the main course was served, the atmosphere began to slow down. David put down his spoon and looked at everyone at the table with a calm but serious expression. "I want to talk about something," he said. The room fell silent. Rachel stopped moving her hands, her face pale. Andrew swallowed hard while Olivia looked puzzled. David continued in a flat voice, "I don't think there's any reason to pretend anymore. Rachel and Andrew, I know you're having an affair." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Ethan dropped his fork, Lily stared at her mother with wide eyes, and Noah whispered in confusion. Olivia froze, then turned to Andrew with a look of rage. Rachel covered her face with her hands, tears beginning to fall. Andrew tried to say something but the words stuck in his throat. Olivia rose from her chair, her voice trembling, "Tell me this isn't true, Andrew." However, the silence she received was the most painful answer. The evening that was supposed to be a warm dinner party turned into a scene of destruction. Two families that had previously seemed harmonious were now on the verge of an inevitable breakup. The atmosphere at the dinner table grew tense. Olivia, who had been calm, was now shouting angrily, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're ruining everything, Andrew. We have children, you still have a choice." Olivia's voice trembled, but her anger was greater than the pain she felt. Andrew, who had initially looked shocked, finally stood up. His face was red but he couldn't say anything. No defense, no excuses. Only silence darkened the dining room. Rachel sat with her body trembling. Her tears flowed uncontrollably, but she couldn't fight the guilt that was eating away at her. There were so many things she wanted to say but her mouth felt locked. David, who sat quietly at the end of the table, showed no anger, only a deeper sadness. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Rachel," David finally said in a heavy voice. "What you two have done has not only hurt me but also our children. This is no longer just about us." Rachel looked at David with eyes full of regret, but it was too late. David could no longer hear the words coming out of her mouth. Olivia walked out of the house without saying a word, taking her two children, who were still in shock, with her. Andrew tried to chase after her, but Olivia was already too far away. The rain that had been falling since early afternoon grew heavier, as if crying with them. David looked at his children, who looked confused and scared. Ethan held David's hand tightly while Lily and Noah looked anxious. "Why is Mama crying?" Lily asked in a small voice. David could only look at his children, trying to hold back his tears. "Papa will explain everything later, dear. But for now we need to be strong, okay?" David replied with a trembling voice. After Olivia left, the house felt empty. There was no more children's laughter, no more Rachel's warm voice. Only silence haunted them. David felt his heart break, but he knew he had to act for the sake of his children. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Outside, the rain continued to pour down. The rooms in the house felt quieter than ever before. The once perfect family was now shattered in an instant. And David, though wounded, was determined to stand firm for his children. Several months after the fateful night that revealed everything, David and Rachel lived their lives growing further apart. Rachel finally left home, deciding to walk away with all the pain that followed her. The divorce was almost inevitable, even though both of them tried to avoid it for some time. However, such deep wounds could not be healed with words alone. Rachel left with few belongings, leaving behind fading memories. She moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a place that was quieter and further away from their old memories. It wasn't the decision she wanted, but it was also not something she could avoid anymore. Every step felt heavy, but she knew this was the price she had to pay for her betrayal. David, though his heart was broken, tried hard to remain a strong father to his children. Ethan, Lily, and Noah now had to accept the fact that the home they once knew would never be the same again. They rarely asked about their mother, but every time they saw old family photos, there was an inexplicable sadness. David learned to hide his pain. He worked harder to give them a better life, trying to keep them smiling even though the house felt empty. He spends his nights taking care of the children, helping them with their homework and making sure they don't feel lost. But every quiet night, every time he stares at the empty bed in the master bedroom, he feels a loss deeper than words can describe. Their lives will never be the same again, and even though he tries to stay strong, the feeling of betrayal continues to haunt him. Meanwhile, Andrew's fate was not much different. After the affair scandal was exposed, his father, who had great influence in the company, fired him. There was no longer a place for him in the family business. Andrew tried to repair his relationship with Olivia, but everything was already ruined. Olivia decided to take the children to another city, away from the bitter memories. They also began to build a new life in a place far from all memories. Rachel and Andrew, even though they loved each other, couldn't escape the fact that their scandal had changed everything. Their family was in shambles and there was no way to get back what they had lost. They each had to accept that their lives were now on different paths. David, despite all the difficulties, tried to find peace. His children began to open up to him more, sharing their feelings even though the wounds were still there. Like their father, they slowly learned to accept reality and move on with their lives even without their mother. However, even though they began to adjust to their new lives, the old wounds remained. Time may heal most wounds, but not all wounds can truly disappear. A year has passed since the event that changed their lives. David and his children are beginning to find balance in their new life. Although their home still feels empty without Rachel, they are trying to make every day a new opportunity to rebuild their happiness, albeit in a different way. Ethan, who used to seem more mature than his age, is now laughing again. He finds happiness in playing sports with his friends and talking more openly about his feelings. Lily, who had become quiet, is starting to return to being a cheerful girl, drawing and writing imaginative stories. Noah, who is younger, seems happier and no longer worries every time he sees his father deep in thought. David tried hard to be the best father he could be. Every night, he read stories to his children before bed, even though he sometimes felt tired. But he knew that this was the only way to give them the security and love they needed. This new life was not easy, but slowly they learned to adjust. Rachel, on the other hand, lived her own life. She restarted her career and tried to find a new routine. However, even though she was trying to rebuild her life, she knew that many things had been lost. Maybe she could find new happiness, but the betrayal she had committed against David and his family would always haunt her. Every time she saw the children, she felt deep regret. On a quiet afternoon, David took the children to the park. They sat together on a park bench, enjoying the fresh air. Ethan and Lily ran around laughing, while Noah sat on his lap. They didn't talk about Rachel or their past. They just sat together, enjoying their simple but meaningful togetherness. David smiled slightly even though the wounds were still there. However, he knew that life must go on. The wounds could not be completely healed, but time had taught them to come to terms with reality. They may never be able to return to their former family, but they had each other, and that was enough. Slowly, they began to learn to live without expecting perfection. Maybe life was not what they had imagined, but at least they could live each day with honesty, love, and the courage to move forward. Their lives are now filled with more genuine laughter, even if it's not perfect. And David, though he still feels the pain, knows that this is a new beginning for them. One that is far better than he ever imagined.